to this important session about the mission of God in biblical, contemporary, and intercultural context. I am so excited that you have joined me today as really we unpack this idea of Missio Dei and the Apostolic Church. One key paradigm shift to explore in missional theology is this concept of Missio Dei. This Latin phrase, it speaks to the mission of God. It is first the call of the Christian community to worship God. We are called to worship the Lord with every ounce within us, every fiber of our being. The community is called by this God, cannot expect its life to be other than that revealed in Jesus Christ. What is Christ doing in us? What does Christ desire to do through us? How did Christ's life exemplify the mission? How did his action redeem and reconcile humanity? Mission cannot be a secondary thing beside some other more fundamental Christian spiritual experience, nor can it be the impetus for mission to come from some external situation, such as loss of membership numbers, or you want to build a larger building of some magnitude. The missionary witness is internal to the gospel itself, as it is core to the very glory of God. We are called to bring God glory each and every day. It is God who has a mission to set things right in a hurting, a broken, and sinful world. He's the one who desires to redeem and restore it to what he has always intended. Therefore, mission, it's not the invention, responsibility, or even the program of the church. Instead, it flows directly from the character and the purposes of a missionary God. In the words of South African missiologist David Bosch, he said this: "It is not the church which undertakes mission, it is the Missio Dei, the mission of God, which constitutes the church." Or perhaps stated another way, it's not so much that God has a mission for his church in the world, but rather that God has a church for his mission in the world. It is not only crucial to understand that God has a mission, it's equally important to understand that his mission is larger than the four walls of a church. We in the church, we wrongly assume that the primary activity of God is in the church. Rather, we need to recognize that God's primary activity, that actually it is in the world. Thus, the church is God's instrument sent into the world. We are his ambassadors. We are his instruments, his tools sent into the world to participate in his redemptive mission. So instead of thinking of the church as an entity that simply sends missionaries, we need to view the church as the missionary. Among other things, this shift in perspective will bring about radical changes in two areas. God's mission must be the organizing principle. So for us to be an apostolic church and a modern day apostolic church, we must examine how did the early church motivate themselves? What were they motivated by? What motivated them toward this godly and divine mission? First, a Missio Dei perspective. It'll shape our thinking about the form and the function of the church. You see, typically, congregations view missions as simply a program or an activity among many other equally important functions of the church. Therefore, the missions program is seen alongside that of worship or small groups, men's ministry, women's ministry, children's ministry, youth ministry, hyphen. When missions is viewed this way, the main business of many missions committee is to simply determine how much to spend the missionary budget on, rather than view the entire congregational budget as an exercise in mission. However, when the church begins to define itself as an agent of God's mission, it will begin to organize each and every activity of the church around the Missio Dei, the mission of God. So, a fellow by the name of Alan Hirsch and Lance Ford, they wrote in Right Here, Right Now. They wrote this: mission as the organizing principle means that mission goes way beyond being some sort of optional activity or program for our churches. Actually, it is the organizing access of the church. Everything revolves around the Missio Dei. The life of the church revolves around God's mission. That is not to say that we don't do corporate worship. In fact, we've got to have great church. We don't develop community. No, we must have great community and connection. We're called to make disciples. But really, these are just instruments in that process. And really, we all ought to be organized around this missionary function. Only then can we be truly missional. So, merely adding service events or special outreach days to a church schedule, that's not going to develop missional people, and that's certainly not going to make a missional church. And so, it's important to recognize that God's mission must be the starting point. Determining where and how to we engage in God's mission then is the second way a Missio Dei theology influences our activity. Determining where is God, what is God doing in our local context, that should inform our theology. It ought to inform our activity. But practically speaking, what does that look like? What does it look like to do mission alongside what God is already doing? If it's about God's mission and not ours, then how do we know where? How do we know when or how to even participate? Well, the answer, at least in part, is that we've got to look for God's activity in a local setting such as that particular place to begin our missional engagement. Mission must therefore, it can't just simply be determined beforehand, but it's got to be discerned. You've got to hear from God, discern what is God leading you to be and do, and where is He leading you to share His love and His light. We've got to be able to discern this in relationship to God's activity in a local context. And so instead of guessing on strategies of what we think a community might need, we've got to listen. We've got to learn what is God already doing in this particular community. Briscoe shares that we ought to consider the 3 Ds of missional to do. We first must discover. We've got to say, God, we want your mission to be central in our life, not ours. We've got to discover, God, what are you doing? Where are you working? The first step in discovering what God is doing is really through listening. Individually and collectively, we've got to cultivate our ability to listen well, really on a variety of fronts. We've got to listen to what is the local community called to be in that particular context, and we've got to listen to each other. It is simply impossible to ascertain the mood of the voices of those we desire to serve. If the first step is about discovering, then the question has to be, what is God doing in this place? That's a great question. Next, we've got to discern. We must discern. So not only will we need to discern what God is already doing, but we need to ask the follow-up question. In light of my gifts, in light of our gifts and resources, how does God want me to participate in what He's doing? The fact is, we can't do it all. I wish we had unlimited resources and unlimited people and space, but we can't do it all. This is true for both the individual follower of Jesus as well as many local congregations. But it's also true that God has gifted us all to do something. You can do something. I can do something. We can do something for the Lord. The point of discernment is to determine where and how to participate in God's mission. Finally, we must debrief. Throughout this process of engaging God's mission, we must create opportunities to reflect on our missional involvement. Sometimes this may be simply asking someone, hey, what do you think about this? Sometimes we need some downtime to reflect on what God is trying to do in a local context. We need to ask God, I pray that you will affirm my involvement or clarify what you have me to do in this particular area. But it means carving out time, reflecting with others in our faith community. We need to hear what other people are saying. We need to sense what God is trying to do. We've got to hear what others are seeing and sensing concerning God's activities. We've got to be willing to listen to the stories of how others are engaging in God's mission. This element, it helps us really put the emphasis on the context into which God has sent us. You are in a particular context. I'm in a particular context. God has planted us here for such a time as this. God has planted you where you are for such a time as this. What has God been doing in that place before you even got there? That's what we've got to be thinking. How's God already been working in this place? Because he's been doing so long before we arrived. So here's a practical example about this idea of Missio Dei. So because of the Missio Dei, we know that the coffee shop we frequent, it's going to be filled with the presence of God. He's already there. Okay, God's already at the local coffee shop. He's at work in the lives of people, whether you show up or not. But God specifically ministers through you. When you begin the conversation with the person at the table, when you begin the conversation with the barista, when you do that, you acknowledge that God is at work. And you choose at that very moment to be the hands and feet of Christ in our community. Now you're joining God for a specific purpose to a person at that moment in time. And at that moment, you have joined the mission of God. And so as we close the session out, I've got some homework to do. Now, you don't have to turn this in for a grade or anything, but really throughout the next week, identify 3 situations where you can ask the following questions. Where do I see God at work? Where and how is God working in the lives of those around me? Where and how is God working in my neighborhood? In light of my gifts and resources, how does God want me to partner with him in what he is doing? And then I would invite you to journal about it somewhere. Consider how you can partner with God's mission in and through your life. As members of this reconciled family in the Lord, we are both invited to experience the Missio Dei, this mission of God, and we are called to extend God's love in the world around us each day. I pray God will help us and God will guide us and direct ourselves as we partner with the Lord and what God is doing as we allow the Missio Dei to motivate us to bless you today.